Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Thank you, Alberto. He introduced me as the moderator. Actually, the moderator is actually a glamorous timekeeper. So I just make sure that these guys, you have 10 minutes each. I'll be very ruthless because we are running late. If we have time after that, then we may have maybe 5 minutes question and answer. This is about Re-Takaful, and the experts are here. We have on my left, let me read, his brother Mahomed Akoob. Where is his picture? He's the managing director of Hannover Re-Takaful. And on his left is Mr. Omar Gouda, managing director Africa Re-Takaful. And on the extreme left is Professor Dr. Volker Nienhaus, Professor of Economics at the University of Bochum. Did I get that right? Germany. Okay, without further ado, let me call on Brother Mahomed Akoob to give his talk. 10 minutes, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think the topic suggests that Re-Takaful is the junior partner of reinsurance. I'd go one step further and say, in the global world, reinsurance is generally the junior partner of the insurance industry in general. Total volumes of premiums in the total market worldwide is about 4.5 trillion, and only a small proportion thereof is reinsurance. So yes, we take that rightful place as being a junior partner. However, it has some substantial influences in what happens in the market. But this afternoon we're going to talk about the Re-Takaful operating environment, and let me see if this works. Yeah. Where we stand in the global sphere of Takaful and Re-Takaful. So having said that, we are part of the COG, and the issues that affect us is the supply and demand, and what are the success factors and challenges that we face. So let's look at a few things. Whilst the interest for Re-Takaful is from a worldwide basis, it's largely and predominantly coming out of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. A large proportion, by definition, of the Takaful is also from this area, and therefore, hence, the largest business that Re-Takaful operators are acquiring is from these two regions. The buying behaviors for these companies in the region are fairly similar. In general, the frequency type of business, motor, personal lines, health insurance is retained, and the frequency or the severity business is obviously sought out from the Re-Takaful or reinsurance market. However, having said that, the relative roles of family Takaful or life Takaful and general non-life Takaful is the sharpest difference between these two regions. In the Southeast Asia market, 70% of the total Takaful contribution is in the sector of the family and health stroke life business, whereas in the GCC market, 70% is the Takaful market, or general Takaful, non-life business. And what are the reasons for that? I think we heard that this morning as well. It's fundamentally the personal lines business in the GCC, motor and health business, and very little insurance penetration, so that the life and health is much lower, and also socioeconomic dynamics differently in the MENA region relative to Southeast Asia, in particular Malaysia, where there's a greater awareness to life and annuity products, and also the absence of government social security to a large extent. So these two fundamentals show that there are differences in the weighting of the business, and it also is reflective of the business results of Takaful companies in these two regions. The preponderance of general Takaful in the Middle East is reflective of the volatility of the business, and hence the results we saw this morning. On the other side, in Southeast Asia, in particular Malaysia, it is weighted heavily towards life and health, or life in particular, and the results are predominantly much, much better. So these are the dynamics that we find relative to the two regions, the major regions. How is the business being operated? Most of the Takaful companies were established between around about 2007, 2008, when the investment environment was buoyant to a large extent, so there was a lot more investment yields coming through, and the business was still new, and therefore there was a lot of cash flow underwriting, hoping for some overturn on the commissions, contributions that you get from Re-Takaful, and that went on for a while. However, unfortunately, the results were not as good as they should be, and therefore things have changed going into the future. That was the demand side. On the supply side, as there is competition for the Re-Takaful, both from Re-Takaful companies on the one hand and from reinsurance on the other. And the question was posed, is there still a future for Re-Takaful companies relative to reinsurance companies? And the answer there, of course, lies in the fact of what is the intent of the Takaful company. We've heard this morning about Turura principles and various other issues, but at the end of the day, we also have to accept that we're in a dynamic market. And when we're in a dynamic market, you cannot just lean on your ethical issues of a Re-Takaful company and expect that the business will flow. So there are certain, of course, disadvantages about that, but the fact is that if a Re-Takaful company can show responsible expertise and business acumen, then there's no reason why they shouldn't be in a position to compete equally with the reinsurance companies. So we do find that. However, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and say, well, is the ethos there to support Re-Takaful companies? The question is, I'll leave that open. I think that depends on the Takaful companies, and there will be various reasons why they may or may not, but I don't think it's, for me, it's a moot point. And I always ask myself, do I push on to the ethical side, or do we have a pure clinical economic conditions and you do what you want? So, it's a question of how you view why you are in the Takaful and why you're in the Re-Takaful. As an organization, and I would not punt the Hannover at all, I would, and my team, would not want to be the recipient of any business on the basis that we are pure Re-Takaful. I think we earn our spur on the basis that we have competent expertise, and the expertise is such that is comparable to any Re-Takaful company worldwide. And if that's the case, then we should be in a position to compete equally. Of course, there are constraints, not so much for the major international Re-Takaful companies, but for regional Re-Takaful companies, there is a lack of retro Re-Takaful. And that is a major problem, certainly a major problem on a worldwide basis. Re-Takaful companies have huge difficulties in getting retro Takaful, or retro Re-Takaful rather, because there aren't any retro Re-Takaful companies in the world. And the Re-Takaful companies, by definition, will be unable to accept this business because of vertical accumulation, which makes it even more difficult for them to operate. So that issue will still be there, and it will remain for a long while until there's maturity in the market and more diversification of the market. The sorry, I was talking the supply side. I've done that. Just give me a minute. Excuse me. Sorry, Chairman. Okay, I've done those. Thank you. Yeah, market issues that we are dealing with. Commoditization. In some instances, Re-Takaful buyers go as far as considering reinsurance a viable substitute for Re-Takaful. I mentioned that a little bit, but I think we need to emphasize that more. And, you know, there are no correct answers on this issue. It would depend on the companies, because at the end of the day, they need to understand to what extent they want their whole value chain to be ethically correct or not correct. But I'm not here to define that, and I think Takaful companies can for themselves decide on those issues. Safe to say that if I'm challenged, then I can say that there is enough Re-Takaful capacity for most of the business. Okay, we found that on an international basis it is available. Yes, with the caveat being that, of course, there are existing relationships with reinsurance companies, and that has to be respected to the extent. The question I would ask is, to what extent has that relationship to be respected relative to the strict Sharia conditions of Re-Takaful? I leave that question open. Leakages because of commoditization. There's a short supply, quantity and expertise issues, and Re-Takaful underwriting disciplines. Yes, again, this is the debate. How qualified are the Re-Takaful companies? And I would tend to suggest that they have adequate expertise, because a large number of these Re-Takaful companies have or have their base as international reinsurance companies, and therefore the expertise is inherent. I can also speak for the regional Re-Takaful companies, who over the last 10 years have developed tremendously, and we have a colleague on the podium, and he can speak for himself as well as a regional person. But I'm honestly of the opinion that the expertise is there. The argument has been that, yes, the pricing is different, and as Re-Takaful industry would argue that that is a moot point. The economic conditions of the reinsurance world on a worldwide basis will not allow you to overcharge just because you are Re-Takaful. Absolutely not. The pricing is almost as competitive as that of a conventional reinsurance. I have yet to find the Re-Takaful being more expensive just because it is the ethical product. And therefore, that argument doesn't stand anymore. Thank you. The chairman is taking the whip out, so let me go fast. Okay. I've mentioned this slide already. The competition challenges. Regulatory changes is one that I didn't talk about, and I'll talk about it quickly. The regulations are changing dynamically, but differently. Malaysia have their own rules for Kurt Hassan deployment and extinguishing thereof. The Middle East have different ones, and it's a challenge. Okay, there are various issues about how to treat this. I wouldn't want to go into detail, Mr. Chairman, right now, but safe to say that we can obviously debate that. Investment returns, limited. We've heard this morning. There are limited investment opportunities. Obviously, that does affect it. But in the wider sense, I would also challenge that to say the worldwide investment yields are limited anyway, so not any more big issue. Human resources, certainly an issue to find the expertise necessary to be able, and I'm talking from the Re-Takaful side, to be able to run the business. So it is an issue. Companies have to try to hold on to the people they have. Finally, my minute is almost over, Chairman. I think whoever is in the Re-Takaful industry needs to appreciate that it's not an avenue for a quick buck. Organizations need to invest in the Re-Takaful company and not expect dividends for at least, in my opinion, 10 years. Then we're talking. The capital has to be built up, retained earnings has to be incorporated in the balance sheet, and Kurt Hassan has to be digested as well. So certainly, if you look at the balance sheets, If there was a debate this morning about, shareholders getting more than the policyholders, I would argue that that's not the case in the Re-Takaful. The shareholders in Re-Takaful companies in general have contributed a substantial amount towards the success of this model. Expenses, while overheads can ruin a Re-Takaful operation, again, it's there, provocative as the statement might be, the markets will not allow Re-Takaful operators to take any wakala fee that is in excess of market norms in the reinsurance industry. Underwriting disciplines, they have to be exactly equal to that of a reinsurance company. So in summary, I would suggest that we shouldn't be the smaller partner of the reinsurance companies. I think we have the same platform, and I would suggest that we need to support the Re-Takaful companies wherever they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Akoob. Actually, for direct Takaful companies, no excuse. For big companies like Re-Takaful companies like Africa Re, Hannover, you have no excuse to use conventional. Okay? Sincerely, if you use Re-Takaful with the sincere to stay Syarikat compliant, Allah will bless your company with less claims. I believe that, yeah? So, pricing aside, I will call on Brother Omar now to give his piece.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I liked what Mohammed mentioned about the relationship between reinsurers and the insurance industry. And actually, we can say that the same is applying, that Re-Takaful operators will be matured or aging when the Takaful industry itself ages also. Because we are facing a lot of difficulties in the primary level of the direct Takaful companies. And the last point that Mr. Akoob just mentioned is actually the main challenge for the grow-up of the Re-Takaful part of the Takaful industry. Because unfortunately, the Re-Takaful operators all the time are facing competition, and it is not even fair competition in many instances. You may have the expertise, you may have the capacity, you may have the prudent approach, but still you are not the favored reinsurer when we come to the protection. Despite that all expectation that the Takaful industry has to support the Re-Takaful operators. We found that many of the Re-Takaful operators struggled during the last years, and just very few who succeeded to continue as full-fledged Re-Takaful operators, while we see also the Re-Takaful windows, I believe they are relying excessively on the support of their parent companies or the main reinsurer to support their operation. Saying that, I believe part of the expectancies of the Re-Takaful part of our industry is relying heavily on the role where the Re-Takaful can play. And I believe also that many of us are expecting the Re-Takaful operator to play the same role of the reinsurers, where they start to innovate, start to lead the way ahead, and not only to be limited to the capacity. We have challenges in the Takaful industry where we really need the support of the reinsurer or the Re-Takaful operator to develop many products, to participate actively in the training of the Takaful staff, just in the same way that the reinsurers are doing. many things we are expected from the Re-Takaful operators, that the Re-Takaful operators can assist Re-Takaful industry in various ways. Enhancement of the takaful for controlling and the legislative framework, because I believe this is the main step where we need to, if we can bridge the gap between the regulators and the organization of the takaful industry in general, and in many countries, I believe this will assist the takaful industry to grow, and hence also the Re-Takaful operators to grow. And this is one of the areas where Re-Takaful operators can play the role to support the industry. Maybe from a point of view of a Re-Takaful operator, I believe that it is not just the support or the profits we are looking for in the takaful and Re-Takaful industry, but it is also we are playing a role for the development of the industry and to support, to sometimes to subsidize the efforts of the takaful industry to launch a successful projects. And this will never be done unless we have a proper legal framework where the clients can easily trust the takaful operators, and also the regulators can find a strong framework to assess and to monitor the takaful activities. And this can be done by the support of the Re-Takaful operators, where we have more experience, more opening to different markets, and we can also present the different experiences to each country, and we can assist for this, definitely. Also, the Re-Takaful operators has to play more roles in creating communication channels within the takaful industry in general, and within the same market between the takaful operators and different other players, to create a common platform where we can work together for the development of the industry. Also, if the takaful industry finds that the Re-Takaful operator is supporting in all issues, they will rely more on the Re-Takaful, and they will come and will not need the support of the normal reinsurers or conventional reinsurers unless the Re-Takaful operators fails to give such support. For example, if we are talking about oil and energy risks, where a large capacity is required and the expertise are required too, Re-Takaful operators has to find a solution, how to quote, how to support such risks, especially in the emerging markets in Africa and Middle East. The energy and the special risks part of the industry is really forming an important growth driver for everyone. Assisting to establish technical institutes or training institutes in our countries or in our regions, I believe also is one of the expected roles. I don't want to go into full details of how the Re-Takaful operator can assist the takaful industry, but definitely as we are looking for the takaful companies and takaful industry to support the Re-Takaful operators to assist to maintain this successful experience so far, and to maintain the continuity of the existing Re-Takaful operator. Also, we are expecting from Re-Takaful operator to do more to prove to the takaful companies that they are trustable and they can give the support required at any time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Omar. Back on time. We have listened to two practitioners. Let's now listen to the professor from the academic perspective. Professor?
Frankly speaking, it's not really the academic perspective, because I was asked to give you a summary or synopsis of the guiding principles for Re-Takaful, which have been issued a bit more than 1 year ago by the Islamic Financial Services Board. And so I give you some reflections on it, but in a very specific manner, namely by being selective. Because I again have this experience, dear Chairman, of evaporating time. Initially it started with 20 minutes, then it became 15, and now I'm down to 10. And that means I have to rush you through the slides, and I have to, let's say, point out a few very interesting elements in these guiding principles, which may be a little bit surprising, or maybe good ideas for services or distinguishing features of a Re-Takaful company compared to a conventional reinsurance company. So to start with, the IFSB guiding principle on Re-Takaful are relatively new, 2016, and there have already been a few guiding principles or standards on Takaful in general, dealing with primary Takaful. I've listed them here: guiding principles on governance, then on solvency requirements and risk management, and at least two general or generic standards for all Islamic financial institutions, namely on conduct of business and on Sharia governance systems. So why another specific Re-Takaful standard? Because there are special issues in Re-Takaful that should be addressed, and so that is the background for this IFSB 18. Now, what are these special issues? Before going to the special issues, it's quite interesting for those who want to learn a little bit more about Re-Takaful. This standard starts with an explanation of concepts and contracts of Re-Takaful, the different models which have been mentioned here, but also different core principles, categories, etc. I don't go into the details here, but then the standard goes to the special issues in Re-Takaful, and the first one is the fact that the participants are Takaful undertakings. That means we are talking now about business-to-business relations, and consumer protection issues are not of the same relevance. However, there are some other aspects that should take into consideration that we have Takaful undertakings, professional companies that are doing transactions. Then, in contrast to most very national Takaful, primary Takaful activities, we have international business here. Re-Takaful is very important for large and specialized risks, which may not be the case in primary Takaful, etc. You can see here the other special issues that have been considered, and there are explanations on that, which I don't want to elaborate too much here. But that, in the end, provided the rationale not only for 11 principles, which have been spelled out in this document, but also for the selection of best practice examples for the Re-Takaful business. And let me summarize briefly the guiding principles in their crudest form, namely just giving you the headlines. They are grouped in 5 categories. The first one is about governance of Re-Takaful, and the first one is that there should be a comprehensive governance framework. The second one is there should be a code of ethics and conduct. There should be, it should be clear and it should be established that truthfulness, honesty, and fairness are the main pillars of the business. Due care and due diligence are important, and systems and procedures should be in place to ensure that governance and conflicts of interest, etc., are handled. If I put it like this, it doesn't sound very exciting, and it doesn't look very, let's say, innovative. And indeed, most of the guiding principles, if you read them, the full wording is not really very exciting. However, what becomes exciting maybe the best practice examples, because that really puts flesh to the bones what these very general principles could mean in practice. So let me just rush through these general principles. When it comes to compliance with Sharia principles, it's very, very, let's say, meager guidance, namely that the business has to be Sharia compliant. Of course, what else? But what does that mean in practice? And there are some surprises or maybe some interesting elements which have been spelled out. Now, then we come to the prudential framework. Adequate risk management framework has to be in place. Solvency and Re-Takaful undertakings. So there are solvency requirements. There are some guiding principles on the solvency of Re-Takaful and on the investment strategy. Regarding transparency, appropriate disclosures should be made. Disclosures not necessarily to the general public, but because we are dealing with other companies, to the business partners. Some of them on request of the business partners, some in general. In addition to, of course, disclosures to the regulators. And finally, there should be a supervisory review, supervision of Re-Takaful or reinsurance programs. Now, I have put the full wording for all these principles here. I don't want to go through that because that takes too much time. But just let me highlight, for example, well, number two, there is, by the way, no 2.2. Some people hate it. I hate this type of numbering, but here it is. There's only a 2.1. RTO is a Re-Takaful operator. A Re-Takaful operator should ensure that all the businesses it undertakes are compliant with Sharia principles, both contractually and in terms of the underlying risks accepted. It should have measures in place to identify and purify tainted income. I don't think that anybody could have anything against this. However, now I have to simply click through these other full explanations. I have collected some of the best practice recommendations, which are not so general, and they are sometimes very specific, and maybe if they would be applied by regulators, they would create some headache with some Re-Takaful operators. And let me just present you, for the sake of time, just my selection of those practice recommendations. There are much more in that document. It is about 70 pages or something like that. It can be downloaded from the IFSB website, so you can read it all by yourself. But regarding, for example, governance, there should be a plan for ensuring continuity of services to cedents if normal operations are interrupted. This and the idea of runoff is, so to speak, for the time being, not a big issue in Re-Takaful, but this point, I think, deserves some attention. It is clearly important in conventional reinsurance. When it comes to the code of conduct, there is the idea that if there are governance issues, for example, conflicts of interest, that there should be something like whistleblowing within the institution, and there should be protection to whistleblowers. Quite a strong thing, I would say. And if we now come to the next, in Code of Ethics and Conducts, suppose a regulator would enforce you to make sure that similar ethics standards are maintained with your service providers. Let's say providers of actuarial services, of IT services, etc. That includes, by the way, Sharia governance issues. So that can be a very, can make you scratching your head how to do that, because you can try, but you don't have direct access to your service providers, external third parties. That's what it is all about. Now I rush through the next four recommendations. I want to go to the Sharia issues. The first one is, and that is also identified as a problem, there is a tremendous lack of technical knowledge amongst Sharia scholars. In particular, there are special types of contracts and implications of these contracts, Sharia implications, which, according to the standard and to the summary or the reflection on the state of art, are not appropriately assessed by the Sharia scholars. So there should be provided sufficient technical knowledge in general, but also all technical knowledge that the Sharia scholars think they would need should be provided on their demand. So technical training, actuarial training, I don't know, contractual training, business training for Sharia scholars. And there should be a policy in place for the distribution of any residual surplus if the Re-Takaful risk fund goes into runoff. Runoff is not very high on the agenda for the time being, but it can happen, and in conventional industry it happens. So what happens if there is a surplus in the Re-Takaful risk fund? That means it is more or less conceptually owned, or should be conceptually owned by the Takaful participants, but how do you handle that? So you should have a policy in place. You should be explicit on this. Sharia assessment of retro-Takaful, you have mentioned the point of retro-Takaful arrangements, but there are some contracts which are also maybe critical from a Sharia perspective, such as profit commissions or ceding commission arrangements in Re-Takaful. They should be examined by the Sharia scholars, not just the overall business model, wakala, or whatever, but these detailed things. And there should be a due diligence of Sharia assessments of the partners, the third-party service providers. So that means the Sharia scholars of a Re-Takaful company should also look into the Sharia, let's say, setup of your third-party business providers. Maybe quite a strong implication. So then there should be a carry-out of an own risk and solvency assessment on a forward-looking basis, and periodical reviews, also not something that can be taken for granted. But again, on the second page, I have to rush through a little bit to keep it to 10 minutes. Well, let me select 3.2. Well, this has been mentioned previously in some previous presentations, the non-fungibility of assets, and so that should be considered in liquidity planning, which may have some quite considerable implications on how you put your liquidity situation. But this year is, to me, quite interesting that the regulatory framework should determine when a Re-Takaful undertaking has to discontinue business. So you should have a clear regulation when you have to close down if you do not meet certain requirements. And suppose that these certain requirements include some of the elements on Sharia compliance and third-party supervision, etc. It might be a very, very challenging framework. Okay, you can see the others. Yes, I rushed to the very last two elements. Namely the heavy reliance on retrocessions to conventional reinsurers, and now that's very interesting, may affect suitability to hold a license to operate as a Takaful undertaking or Re-Takaful undertaking. And again, this is a recommendation, and the IFSB is making recommendations not to the general industry but to the regulators. Suppose the regulator picked this up, it can cause some difficulties. And finally, again, the adequate Sharia oversight of intermediaries, meaning, for example, brokers, agencies, etc. Again, you have to check what all your intermediaries are doing Sharia-wise, which is in particular a problem if we are talking about these low frequency and high impact risks, where you need something like preparedness for catastrophic situations, epidemia, etc. And there you probably will have to work with a lot of so-called intermediaries. So altogether, while initially it looks quite, let's say, boring or not so exciting, if you just take the wording of the guiding principles, the real business, the real secret is in the recommendations, and maybe some of these recommendations, like checking the Sharia quality of your service providers, could be something that Re-Takaful undertakings might do on their own, because that might be an added value that they can offer compared to what you can get from a reinsurance. It's not only the capacity, but Sharia compliance in many different aspects. So maybe also Re-Takaful undertakings might want to look at this document, which is downloadable from the IFSP website, ifsp.org, and then you will find it. Thank you very much.